So give me your definition of democracy. What is a democracy?
A democracy is a system in which the governed govern. You can read a lot of political theory, you can read the classics. I don't think you get a definition that is more succinct than that. Another formulation is Lincoln's, government of, by, and for the people. And so in a democracy, the people themselves are the people who govern. It's not entrusted as a responsibility to some alien authority, some external power, some other hierarchy. People take upon the responsibility and burden and promise of governing themselves. That's the core idea.
So how do you know that America in 2025 is not by the people and for the people, that the governed are not actually governing?
So I think there are three characteristics of any democratic system. The first is political equality. People are equal in standing when they come to make a collective choice. So when it comes to the Senate, for instance, we have one of the most malapportioned upper houses in the world. I think only Argentina and Brazil among our peers are more malapportioned than ours. The second characteristic is responsiveness. There's real authority amongst the public. When they come together to make a collective choice, things happen. And the last thing I would say is majority rule. But as I write, I think in very, very basic ways, our system flouts all three of these things. So over the course of talking about this book now, I've done a lot of events in Washington, D.C. That is a city of about 700,000 people in this country without full representation in Congress. Eleanor Holmes Norton, the one delegate they have, cannot cast a vote in the final passage of legislation in the House. There are 4 million Americans for whom that is true. Most of them live in Puerto Rico. They are governed by the federal government without a full equal say in governance. That, I think, by any reasonable definition, is not a democratic arrangement. It's something that's troubled people for many years in this country. But even beyond that extreme, those of us who do have representation have very unequally apportioned representation. Classic example, California is a state of about 40 million people. For its own country, be one of the 40 largest countries in the world, is one of the largest economies in the world, has the same number of senators as Wyoming, state of fewer than 600,000 people, fewer, in fact, than Washington, D.C. That means functionally that people in Wyoming have about 60 or more than 60 times the representation of people in California do in the Senate. I don't think that's a merely academic point. You hear in school that this is balanced out by the House. It's not really in a substantive way. The Senate alone shapes the judiciary, it shapes the executive branch. And obviously it's a veto point for the passage of even ordinary legislation. So right away, and I think the Senate is the crux of a lot of this, we have a fundamental piece of our system that flouts basic democratic principles, basic democratic intuitions, again, more so by international comparison than some of our peers. No country gets it perfect. There's no ideal democracy out there in the world. But I think it's fair to say that a system is not really democratic as much as it might purport to be one.
And what about the economic component? How is a vision of economic equality, in your view, essential to having a functional democracy or having a democracy that is actually democratic?
Yeah, well, this is one of the central provocations of the book. And I think the kind of background intuition that people have in mind, even if they don't sort of know it consciously about democracy, is that we are entitled to an amount of say, a basic level of say, over the conditions that shape our lives, right? We're not mere victims of circumstance, helplessly thrown about by the universe. We're not the peons of particular hierarchies of people who are more powerful than us or more privileged than us. That's a basic democratic intuition. And I think, one of the things that have gone around in progressive circles over the last decade or so is you have people like Elizabeth Anderson, for instance, who make the point that we are governed in more spaces than just the political sphere. We spend about a third of our time at work. The decisions that are made at the top of corporations we work for often affect us more directly, intimately, and immediately than decisions made in Washington, D.C., or in our state houses or our city hall. And yet we feel that we're not democratically entitled to any kind of voice in those spaces, except for maybe hoping that we can act through government to regulate the economy. When we try to do that, we find that Washington, D.C. and our political institutions are often dominated by wealthy people, our bosses. And I think that when it comes to solving the concrete problems of inequality, worker power, the absence of worker power, the absence of worker voice is one of the things that's contributed to our current economic situation. That is a democratic problem. And I think it sort of suggests democratic solutions as well.
All right, let's do an excursion then back in time.
Yeah.
to the American founding? Because one of your arguments, right, is that America was not actually intended to be a democracy.
Right.
That, in fact, we should understand our founding almost in terms of a kind of oligarchic coup. So talk a little bit about your view of the founding.
Right. So, I mean, when you raise some of the objections that I've raised about the nature of our system, conservatives will often say, well, we're a republic, not a democracy. I think liberals by habit say, no, that's not true. The founders actually intended democracy, but they messed up in 50 million different ways. I think the conservatives have the better side of the argument when you actually look at the historical record. And I think that people should understand that the Constitution is forged in a particular political and economic context. At the end of the American Revolution, we're in a state of true economic crisis. A lot of reasons for this. Land is destroyed and ravaged. Slaves escape. Trade restrictions are imposed by the British. Poor farmers, especially people in the backcountry across the nation, are appealing for debt relief and for tax relief. They're asking if they can pay their taxes and their debts in kind with goods. They're asking for different measures of economic assistance. And one of the main things they're asking for, actually, is the circulation of paper money. There's a shortage of hard currency in the country. They believe that the circulation of paper money will make it easier for them to pay down their obligations. This deeply, deeply troubles the wealthiest people in America. There's a belief that this undermines the stability of contracts, that it frustrates or complicates the creditworthiness of the country. And there's just this belief, too, that people are in economic distress because they hadn't been frugal enough. They were spending on gambling and drinking, on luxuries imported from Europe. There's a lot of very
understanding is that they were, in fact, spending on drinking.
Well, yes,
to a substantial degree.
To a substantial degree. Is that the source of economic distress across the country? Probably not. But there's a lot of colorful writing that Woody Holton goes through in Unruly Americans, if people want another read on this. And so people are successfully appealing to state governments for this relief, with the exception of a state like Massachusetts, very conservative in its design with the state constitution. It resists these appeals. In fact, it increases taxes. And you have this uprising, which people may have heard about in school, Shays' Rebellion, this armed uprising that is eventually put down. And it alarms the founders significantly. There have been abortive attempts to rework the Articles and to reform government before then. But they come to understand that the state governments had gotten under control. They were actually directing the economic situation in the country, and something needed to be done. They needed a stronger, sovereign federal government that could act directly upon people, that could request taxes and revenue directly from people, and that would actually be less accessible democratically than the prevailing order had been. And they come to Philadelphia in 1787 with that understanding. And this is not a matter of speculation. We have one of the very first speeches made at the convention is made by Edmund Randolph of Virginia, where he says, look, the thing that actually brought us together here is the excess of democracy at the state constitutional level. We have pamphlets and obviously the Federalist Papers. We have a real body of information that informs us as to what they were thinking when they designed some of these institutions. And, it's not history that I think most Americans are familiar with or are encouraged to think about, but it matters. It matters in getting us to understand why the institutions we have function the way that they do. But I also think it gives us a kind of permission. This was not some kind of sacred compromise that came down a mountain on tablets. Like, this was a particular contingent agreement, and we should consider ourselves empowered with all we know now about governance, with the values we have now, to make dramatic changes to the political system with just as much right as the founders did.
Right, but it is also, in a way, an invitation that Americans have been accepting, right, since barely after the ink was dry on the Constitution. Because I think there's another narrative which says a number of influential founders, for different reasons, envisioned a more aristocratic form of Republican government than what we've ended up with. But some of that just sort of evaporated at the start. Right, founders did not anticipate political parties. Founders imagined a version of the Electoral College, or at least some did, where literally the electors would be, wise men deliberating. Right, and that collapses very quickly. And then you just have a sequence across the 19th and 20th century where the country, steadily becomes more responsive to to Democratic majorities. And this starts with Andrew Jackson, who is currently a figure in great disrepute on the left, but democratizes the system in a way that once led to him being celebrated, right? There, in the old days of the Jefferson Jackson dinners that the Democratic Party used to have, and all of the narratives around New Deal liberalism celebrate Jackson as a democratizer. But you have the expansion of the franchise over time to women, to freed slaves, African Americans, and so on, right? And so you have, by the time you reach the civil rights era and the middle of the 20th century, right, you have a landscape where that founding constitution, you have the direct election of senators. So America becomes, you would agree, right, much more democratic.
Of course. I wouldn't dispute that at all. We're living in a much more democratic society today in all kinds of ways than we were in 1787. I wouldn't dispute that. I think the case I'm making, though, is that these central institutions that the founders set up in 1787 in many ways survive today. Yes, we have the direct election of senators, that is true, but we have equal apportionment still, which is one of the central compromises they made at the convention. For all they might have disliked democracy, Madison and Hamilton both thought that the principle of equal apportionment went too far in advantaging the small states. They say this at the convention. They say this in the Federalist Papers. The small states were going to walk out. In fact, Gunning Bedford of Delaware says during the convention—
Keep Rhode Island happy.
You got to keep them happy. But, Gunning Bedford, I think, makes a speech at convention where he says basically, look, we will secede. We will join some other foreign power if we don't get a preservation of equal apportionment, which we'd had under the Articles of Confederation in the new system, right? So that feature, which Madison warns about, I think, quite cogently at the convention, continues to be perverse and continues to generate perverse outcomes for us to this day. People talk about the Senate in this respect, especially with population trends continue. Smaller and smaller proportion of the country will win a greater and greater proportion of the seats. This is going to continue to distort governance, and actually the distortions are going to worsen. A presidency that we've seen in the last 6 months especially, I think validates some of the concerns people had at the founding about whether they were creating some kind of monarchical or quasi-monarchical executive. And so I think that, for all we've done to expand the right to vote, democratize the system, include the public in more and more places, I think all of that is real. But I think it's time for us to really consider all of these things. I think it's time for us to consider, to the extent that people are angry about Donald Trump, again, what are the elements of the system that allow Donald Trump to rise as a political figure and that have sustained him? I think they're, to an ironic extent, some of the elements that the founders hoped would prevent somebody like Donald Trump from coming into power.